So we are moving now to another utopian technology, which is, has arguably been one of the most utopian technologies of the 20th century, nuclear power, the technology that promised boundless energy, but also which also contains a promise of boundless destruction. Many scholars have argued that nuclear power has been central for the Soviet and post-Soviet Russian identity. Achieving the first chain reaction in 1946, catching up with the US by testing a nuclear bomb in 1949, designing a nuclear reactor capable to generate electricity in 1956, developing nuclear icebreakers to access the Arctic, the Soviet government used nuclear power as a symbol of modernization and a proof of the great power status. The Soviet utopia of the future was both powered and secured by nuclear power. However, as I suggest in this paper, the notion of a nuclear-fueled Soviet modernity was not a unitary utopia. It was a heterogeneous assembly of concepts, narratives, imaginaries, and materials. To be sure, there was a very clear and fairly rigid set of official narratives and explanations that outlined the Soviet take on the nuclear power in the Cold War context, and Paul Josephson has written a lot about Soviet and post-Soviet Russian nuclear cultures. But these narratives, these official narratives, were also criticized. They were also undermined through revelations of the social and environmental consequences of nuclearization, but also they were chipped away and made almost irrelevant by alternative configurations of the material culture of Soviet nuclear power. So today, Russian nuclear power is 77 years old, and it has acquired a historic patina. This history is, however, marked with catastrophic ruptures and turns of a narrative making sense of it all. The post-Soviet Russian nuclear industry continues drawing on the repertoire of a Soviet nuclear culture, but it is also shaped by multiple negotiations, contestations, and plural agencies. So this is a cast iron bust of Lavrentiy Beria, the notorious head of the secret police and the Stalin. Beria was also in charge of creating the repression apparatus and running the Gulag system, as well as creating and managing the Soviet atomic program. In 1942, following an advice of nuclear physicists, he initiated the research on the atomic bomb, which was accelerated in 1945 and leading to the testing of a bomb in August 1949. This figure is a souvenir, and it was commissioned by Rosatom, the Russian state atomic energy corporation, in February 2023, just 2 months ago. It leaked to the press that Rosatom ordered several hundred of tiny, pocket-sized Beria busts, and even Russian journalists couldn't quite get their heads around what did we mean by that? Are they going to give it as a corporate gift to the cherished clients? Is this a paper press? What is it? It's not the first time that Rosatom attempted to give flesh to the Beria figure. 2 years ago, in 2021, Rosatom announced that there will be a wax figure of Beria displayed in the newly built atomic pavilion at the VDNH, the former All-Union Exhibition Center in Moscow. And this pavilion is about to be completed at the end of 2023. Now, this prompted protest letters from the grandchildren of the designers of the Soviet nuclear bombs, whose grandparents were also meant to be cast in wax and displayed in the future museum of the Russian atomic power in this pavilion. And we did not want to see the statues of the ancestors displayed next to Beria. To the defense of casting Beria in wax, the CEO of Rosatom said that it's not a monument because we're not using bronze. It's only wax. So there is a very strong tension between competing narratives, but also groups that are engaged in making sense about the nuclear past in Russia. The first one, promoted by Rosatom, is in line with Putin's rehabilitation of the Stalinist regime and is keen to display both Beria and Stalin as patrons of the Russian nuclear power. The second one, preferred by the nuclear industry veterans, people who actually produced reactors and nuclear weapons, they seek to separate the difficult legacy of Stalinist repressions from the development of nuclear power, and they want to see their work effort as a Russian contribution to world science. In effect, we are trying to depoliticize the nuclear industry. Obviously, neither narrative is balanced. They both seek to either politicize or depoliticize the nuclear industry and nuclear past so as to bolster their own institutional interests. There is, however, a third narrative that seeks to open up the history of repressions through the lens of the Cold War nuclear heritage. And this narrative is not backed officially by Rosatom, but it is shaped from the inside of Rosatom by the grassroots of nuclear industry veterans, well, some of them, not all of them, but also by anti-nuclear activists and the many residents in nuclear cities, nuclear areas. So all these groups are actually entangled. It's not that they live in parallel universes, they're actually enmeshed socially, institutionally, and spatially. And we all are engaged in assembling material culture of the nuclear past. I'm very much interested in the activities of the grassroots groups and the way in which they try to use reflecting on the development of nuclear power so as to show the entanglement of the catastrophic Gulag system and the utopian nuclear industry. So they try to document the many nuclear accidents and the wide-scale contamination, as well as to commemorate people who lost their lives, health, and livelihoods as the result of the expansion of the nuclear complex. Right. Okay. So now I would like to show just how complicated this effort is and how resistant is Rosatom and parts of Russian nuclear community in kind of coming to terms with the Stalinist and repressive roots of the Soviet nuclear utopia. And I would like to talk more about the example of Serov, which is the heartland of the Soviet nuclear empire. So as a foreigner, and I'm not a Russian citizen, I could not visit Serov because it is only open to Russian citizens or foreign citizens if you are fortunate to come as part of a very high-level formal delegation. However, I was able to analyze secondary materials, presentations of Serov in other Russian museums and sites, and I was able to interview several persons directly involved in heritage making in the city. So the village of Serov is famous as the home place of Saint Seraphim of Serov, one of the most prominent saints, Orthodox saints of the 19th century. Saint Seraphim was also promoted in the early 20th century alongside Pushkin as a key figure of Russian culture. In the 1940s, the village that features a monastery and a church dedicated to Saint Seraphim was chosen as a location for the design and construction of nuclear weapons. Following the introduction, of course, of the communist government, Serov Monastery was closed down and repurposed for a missile factory. So because of its strategic location. So it's not too far from Moscow, and it already had some industrial infrastructure, so it was deemed to be suitable for the center of the design of nuclear weapons. Right, so in Russia, so it was a closed city, and in Russia, during the Soviet times, there were several hundred of such closed cities, and currently there are about 40 cities with closed city status, and Serov is one of them. In the 1940s, the place, the name was changed. It was officially called Arzamas 16. It was also referred to by its residents as object or object. And you could not find this place on the map, although it was served by a train line. It wasn't mapped as a station, and even today you can get a train from Moscow to Sarov. But you can buy a ticket only with a special permission, and the stop is not marked on the network. It was also served by a small military airport. Okay, so it's home to many nuclear scientists and nuclear weapons designers and engineers. And there have been several generations since the 1940s of people living on the site, so there are several generations of children who grew up there. And the place has acquired a very interesting, very hybrid local identity. So actually the members of a very early nuclear program, already back then in the 1950s and 60s, they were thinking about their posterity and their own cultural legacy. However, their possibility to make themselves visible was greatly restricted because of general secrecy. However, the first museum for Kurchatov, who was the kind of father of the Soviet Russian nuclear power, was opened in Moscow in the 1960s. And in turn, at Arzamas 16, engineers wanted to establish what we called a Hermitage Museum of Nuclear Weapons, and we wrote about that as early as 1978. So now the 1980s saw a particularly interesting dynamic tension in the development of nuclear cultural assemblies. Starting in 1983-1984, there was a growing public debate about the climate impact of nuclear war, and there was growing public support for arms control and denuclearization. Following the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, Gorbachev dismissed Anatoly Alexandrov and Yefim Slavsky, the heads of Soviet nuclear complex, and as he put it, a quote, the Soviet nuclear complex was dominated by servility, bootlicking, cliquishness, and persecution of those who think differently, end of quote. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and now Russian nuclear industry was facing severe economic decline. So the nuclear sector in the early 90s found itself no longer a priority industry. Like in other sectors, salaries of the staff were unpaid, and for the first time in their life experience, the residents of atomic cities faced shortages. So in this context, as historian Dmitry Adamsky showed, the nuclear industry was desperately searching for means to justify itself. After Chernobyl and after the end of the Cold War, it was no longer self-evident if Russia required a nuclear shield, and what its bright future could be, was it nuclear powered or not. And so it was precisely in this moment when glasnost, economic decline, and democratization intertwined that the nuclear industry began to selectively assemble and stage the history of nuclear weapons. And here the key moment was the initiation of an exhibition of the Soviet nuclear weapons in Sarov. It was opened in 1992 and visited by Boris Yeltsin. In 1995, the city gifted a mock-up of the shell of the first bomb to the Polytechnical Museum in Moscow, and so atomic weapons were displayed for the first time in public museums in Russia. But in the mid-90s, that didn't mean militarization. That meant attempt to open up and to explore the repressive roots of the nuclear power. Okay, the 2000s saw a new and very different stage in the management of the nuclear industry, with the appointment of Sergei Kiriyenko as the CEO of Rosatom. A specialist unit was created in the Public Relations Department to take care of history and cultural matters of the sector. As it has turned out, hundreds of enterprises, institutes, laboratories, and cities that formed part of the Rosatom empire now or then competed with each other for status, recognition, contracts, and staff. The city authorities were particularly interested in enhancing the cultural attraction of the localities, and in doing so, ended up creating a very peculiar blend of heritage, which combined local history with ecclesiastic heritage, World War II commemorations, and presentations of the nuclear industry, but highly specific to the locality. So it could be uranium processing, it could be nuclear weapons, it could be submarine nuclear reactors, depending on the type of labs which were in those particular locations. And in this context, Sarov became a particularly important case in point. First, as Adamski showed, the very survival and later revival of the town was enmeshed with its re-establishment as a spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy and the place of Saint Seraphim. So the Seraphim Church, originally built in 1903, was converted into a theater during the Arzamas 16 time. It was consecrated and reopened in 2003, and it was the first time when Putin visited Sarov. The monastery was also renovated, and the city was opened for pilgrims. And furthermore, Orthodox Church in general started to promote the nuclear industry and declared Saint Seraphim a patron saint of nuclear industry in Russia. In 2017, Seraphim's bones were sent to space station to consecrate it, and they were then returned back to Russia successfully. All of these odd things going on, but the ecclesiastic narrative did very little to recognize the victims of Stalinist nuclearization or the negative impacts and programs of the nuclear sector. So I would like to show some of the pictures from an album published by Sarov detailing its history. So you see kind of the soldiers patrolling the perimeter of the place, the church, the monastery. This little wooden house was actually received by the Soviet Union from Finland as a form of reparations, and that's where first nuclear engineers and scientists lived there. And what's amazing is that you have on the same level documentation of nuclear explosions and then illustrations of what looks like a very idyllic, even rural life of workers. Okay, the repressive roots of nuclear power are actually articulated in the heritage space in Russia, but not in Sarov. This is, for example, documentary footage about the building of Arzamas 16 at the Polytechnical Museum in Moscow. Okay, so now I would like to wrap up my talk by contrasting two patron saints, so to speak, of Soviet Russian nuclear power, Saint Seraphim and Andrei Sakharov. And Andrei Sakharov is a very interesting case that shows the fragmentation of Soviet nuclear utopia. So he was the prominent nuclear physicist who contributed to the design of the first atomic bomb, and who then was key for design of the first thermonuclear bomb, the biggest of which was tested in 1961, after which Sakharov turned anti-nuclear and became a very prominent human rights activist in the Soviet Union. He also designed the tokamak fusion reactor, which still is kind of used as a symbol of great hopes of nuclear industry internationally, promising the fusion, harnessing the fusion power. So Sakharov, now I have to really wrap it up, protested against the cult of Stalinism in the late 60s. He was exiled to Nizhny Novgorod in the 1980s. He was rehabilitated in 1986 and then became the symbol of Soviet human rights movement, and he died in the late 80s. So what was happening in the 2000s is something really, really weird. So in Moscow there is the center of Andrei Sakharov here, dedicated to the promotion of human rights, but also commemoration of the work and legacy of Andrei Sakharov. This center was declared a foreign agent in 2020, 2012 because it's funded by different Western funders. At the same time, Rosatom are promoting Sakharov's figure as the prominent Russian nuclear scientist. So here you see the opening of a monument to Sakharov in Serov. This was done in 2021 after COVID, where descendants of Sakharov were invited. And 3 months ago, the Sakharov Center in Moscow was evicted from their premises, so they're in effect being shut down. I will have to skip this. So basically what is going on, but there is this very selective appropriation of even anti-nuclear activists within the contemporary Russian nuclear discourses. So that's interesting. We are not outright rejected, we are selectively defragmented and appropriated. And there is a very interesting and disturbing selective appropriation of and rehabilitation of the Stalinist regime. And I would like just to say this to end. There is little rationality and little logic to the attempts to reinvent the Soviet nuclear utopia and to make it work for Putin's Russia. One can understand why Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika and the years of democratization are erased from the forms of history and heritage making as they are happening today in Russia. And one can understand why Beria is praised by the nuclear industry themselves for efficiency. He is praised even as a reformer of the system. But when even the fate of Beria does not subsume to a linear story, it melts and slips away. In a serendipitous move, it was at the first Moscow's crematorium, which was opened in what was a repurposed St. Seraphim Church, originally built in 1914, that Beria was cremated after he was executed. And his ashes were scattered in the New Donskoy Cemetery in Moscow. Now, in 1992, the crematorium was reconsecrated as the church of the patron of the nuclear industry, St. Seraphim. And the anti-religious Beria's figure is re-embodied in wax and cast iron, and they somehow coexist in these incredible loops together. And to me, this is a perfect example of how the fragments of the Soviet utopia and of the great communist power and of the Orthodox Empire get molded and recast time and again. Thank you.